We've been working on step 36. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 36. And Psalm 36 is a very interesting psalm. And I wanted to talk about some of the issues in here from the standpoint of the Hebrew that's not readily understandable from the English. So, starting off at the beginning, to the chief musician. This is lam netzach in the Hebrew. Netzach means to look at something from a higher sense. So it refers to a supervisor who's looking down on his employees, and that's why it's translated to the chief musician, the supervising musician. But it also means to look at it in a higher sense in terms of understanding something spiritual. So whenever you see this term in the Psalms, which you see this in a lot of Psalms, what you're going to look for in the Psalm is some spiritual understanding. And we certainly do have some spiritual understanding that we're going to get out of this Psalm. And then it says, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord. Literally it says, to David, to the servant of Yahuwah. Now remember we said that in step 36, Galatians 4, that it was talking about the idea that we are a servant. As even if we're a descendant of Abraham, we are still a servant until we get adopted, and we act like a servant in the sense that as a child we're going to get discipline, we're going to get training, we're not going to be trusted, we're going to be supervised, and so this is what he's mentioning here, is the fact that he is a servant. As a trainee, he is a servant. He's learning to be a servant. And once he gets adopted, he's going to be good at being a servant. He's going to be a trusted member. He'll be able to run the ranch and not have to have somebody watching over his shoulder all the time. Okay, and then it says, an oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked. Okay, this is, Naum means pleasant, and Pasha means transgression. A transgression is where you are overstepping your bounds. You have your territory and God has his territory. And when you step into God's territory with sin, when you're sinning, you're saying, God, move over. I'm taking over this territory. I'm going to run things instead of you. That's what transgression is. Okay? Trespassing, basically. And then Rasha is wickedness, meaning built up sin. A lot of sins that are built up. Near my heart, okay, is what that's saying. And basically what he's saying is that the wicked, the transgression of the wicked, the temptation of the wicked, is not somebody out there, it's somebody in here. That is our tendency within ourselves that he's talking about. Okay? So, within my heart. And then he says, there is no fear of God before his eyes. Meaning that when I get a temptation and I go ahead and I sin, what am I saying? I am a child. I'm up at the Galatians level, and I know that God is right here. I know He's watching me, and I go ahead and I sin. Why? Because I do not have a fear of God. And this word fear is actually dread of God. I should dread God when I sin in His presence. When you know that He is right here, and you go ahead and you do it anyway. You don't have a dread of God. And we should have a dread of God if we're sinning in His face like that. Okay? Which is what we do when we understand that He's right here because of our growth level, and we still sin, right? And we do. That's exactly what we do, right? For he flatters himself in his own eyes. So we understand, we think that what we're doing is okay. We think what we're doing is fine. See, why do people sin? They sin because they think there's some advantage in that sin. But remember I mentioned a while back that sin is actually a cluster of things. So there is the sin that's involved in it, which is a violation of a commandment. But there's also good things. Okay, so fornication, for example, involves sex, which comes from God, so that's a good thing. But the fact that you're doing it with someone who's not your wife is the sin part of it. And so we have this cluster, and in our mind, we're not thinking about the sin part of the cluster, which is a bad thing. We're thinking about the good thing, which is actually from God. Okay, so all of the things, all of the sins that we get into, we think they're good because we're looking at the godly part of the cluster. And what we need to do is get rid of the sin part of the cluster and hang on to the godly part, and then we can do it and really enjoy it, right? That's what we want to do. But when we flatter ourselves, we're telling ourselves this propaganda. We're telling ourselves that what we're doing is okay. But then we have to find out that his iniquity and when he hates. Literally, it says, we find out that his iniquity is hatred. Now, we talked about love last Shabbat, and we've been talking about that from time to time. And the idea is that the commands are love, if you understand the commands correctly. And sins, therefore, are hatred, if you understand sins correctly. Okay? So, what are you doing when you sin? If you steal from somebody, that's obviously causing a problem for someone, right? But fornication, on the other hand, you might say, well, that's love. You know, I'm flattering myself. I'm propagandizing myself that this is love. But it's actually hatred. And we find out that it's hatred when that sin cluster, when we're doing that sin cluster, and eventually it causes all kinds of problems, right? So now you have someone who is in the wrong position of relationship with you, who is causing problems. They're not compatible with you, you know, etc., etc. And so when we're doing the sin cluster, there's going to be consequences. And the consequences aren't that God is spanking you. The consequences are just natural consequences. When you do those things, they cause problems. You don't realize it at first because you're propagandizing yourself that this is a good thing. But as things go on, eventually it catches up with you, and you find out that that was really a bad thing, and that if I had done it the way God wants me to do it, it would be much better. It would be good for the other person rather than bad for them. And so if I'm doing something that's good for another person, that's love. And if I'm following God's instructions, then it's going to be good for that other person. But if I'm not following God's instructions and I think it's good, it's really not. And it's going to cause problems for them. It's going to cause problems for me. It's going to cause problems down the road. God knows it. We don't, because we're propagandizing ourselves. But God knows it. And if we do what he tells us to do, we can avoid all those problems that are going to result from that sin. Now, he says he finds out that his iniquity is hate. In other words, the sin that he's doing is actually hurting someone else. But the word for sin here is very interesting. The word is iniquity. In the Hebrew, it is avon, which starts with an aleph. Okay? Now, an aleph, you'll see words. Aleph is a silent letter, but it normally has an aw vowel point with it. Ayin, on the other hand, is also a silent letter, and it has oftentimes an aw vowel point with it. And so they sound just the same, okay? But you'll see these words, and they'll start off with, you'll have one word that is spelled the same, except it starts with an aleph, and the other word is spelled the same, except it starts with an ayin, and it's pronounced the same, right? And this is very interesting because an aleph is an ox, and it represents God, and so it's something that is good normally, right? An ayin, on the other hand, is the I, and it's talking about us. So aleph is going to talk about God. Ayin is going to talk about the self. And so normally the words that use the ayin are bad words, and the words that use the aleph are good words. But in this case, it's very interesting because it's talking about doing something that belongs to God. Okay, remember we talked about this idea of transgression, right? We are trespassing. We are doing something that belongs to God. And that's exactly what's going on here. Because this word, iniquity, actually it means virility, okay? It means the ability to produce. But it's talking about producing on your own, okay? And without God, see, it means you.